The weapon that built the Mafia, the Tommy gun story. Chicago, 1929. The city is drowning in corruption. Bootlegging empires are worth millions, and blood spills over every street corner. Rival gangs aren't just fighting. They're waging war. And in this war, one weapon decides who lives and who dies. The Thompson submachine gun, the Tommy gun, the deadliest icon of the 20th century. This gun wasn't just a tool. It was a revolution. It built the American Mafia, turned small-time criminals into kings, and forced the government to rewrite the nation's gun laws. But how did a weapon designed for soldiers on the battlefield end up ruling the streets? To understand the rise of the Tommy gun, we have to go back to 1918, the final year of World War I. General John T. Thompson, a weapons expert for the U.S. Army, had a vision. A fast-firing, lightweight machine gun that could clear enemy trenches in seconds. He called it a trench broom, and when the first prototypes rolled out, it looked like the future of modern warfare. There was just one problem. By the time the gun was perfected, the war was already over. Thompson's company, Auto Ordnance, had thousands of machine guns, but no army to sell them to. Desperate to make a profit, they started looking for anyone who had the cash. The first buyers, police departments, private security forces, even ranchers who wanted protection from cattle rustlers. But there was a catch: the price. A brand new Tommy gun cost $200 in the early 1920s. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $3,500 today. Most law enforcement agencies couldn't afford them, but one group could: the Mafia. When Prohibition started in 1920, alcohol became illegal in the U.S., but making something illegal doesn't make it disappear. It just creates a black market. And that market turned street thugs into crime lords overnight. Bootlegging became America's most profitable illegal business, generating billions of dollars in today's money. With so much money on the line, gangsters needed firepower, and nothing delivered firepower like the Tommy gun. Before the Thompson, mobsters relied on revolvers and sawed-off shotguns. Messy, slow, easy to counter. But with a Tommy gun, a single gangster could spray an entire room with bullets in seconds. It was the ultimate weapon for intimidation, execution, warfare. And nowhere was that more evident than in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. February 14, 1929. The bitter cold morning in Chicago feels no different from any other. But inside a quiet garage on North Clark Street, the city is about to witness one of the most brutal killings in American history. 7 men, members of George Bugs Moran's North Side Gang, standing casually, expecting a routine alcohol delivery. Then, the doors swing open. 2 uniformed police officers walk in, guns drawn. Behind them, 2 more men enter, dressed in trench coats, faces hidden by fedoras. The gangsters think it's a raid. They're used to this. Bootlegging is illegal. Getting arrested is just part of the job, so they comply. They line up against the brick wall, hands raised. Then, boom! The room erupts in gunfire. 2 Tommy guns unleash over 70 bullets in a matter of seconds. The walls explode with shattered brick. Blood sprays across the cold concrete. Bodies crumple to the floor. By the time the real police arrive, the killers are long gone. The only survivor, Frank Gusenberg, is barely clinging to life. He's been shot 14 times. When officers ask who did it, he mutters his final words: "Nobody shot me." He dies moments later. The massacre shocks the nation. Until now, gang violence had been seen as just thugs killing thugs. But this was an execution. Newspapers go wild. "Machine gun massacre in Chicago," screams one headline. Another reads, "The devil's paintbrush strikes again." The Tommy gun isn't just a weapon anymore. It's a symbol of power, of fear, of absolute dominance. And its reputation is about to grow even deadlier. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre changed everything. Until that moment, Americans knew about gang violence, but never like this. This wasn't a back alley shooting. It wasn't a couple of guys getting into a fight over a deal gone bad. This was organized execution, military-level firepower on the streets of America. The photos of the massacre hit newspapers across the country. 7 bodies, lined up against a blood-stained brick wall, torn apart by over 70 bullets. And at the center of it all, the Tommy gun. The massacre created a nationwide panic. If gangsters could pull off something this brutal, what was stopping them from doing it again? For the first time, the American public started to fear the Mafia. And they weren't the only ones. Politicians, police chiefs, even the president himself. They were all forced to respond. But there was a problem. Tommy guns were completely legal. That's right, in the 1920s and early 1930s, anyone with enough money could walk into a gun store and buy a brand new Thompson submachine gun. No background check, no registration, no restrictions. Gun shops advertised them in catalogs as the ideal home defense weapon. One ad even showed a drawing of a businessman defending his home with a Tommy gun, promising that it would keep your property safe from criminals and trespassers. The irony? It wasn't homeowners who were buying them. It was the criminals. The Mafia wasn't just using Tommy guns, they were stockpiling them. By the early 1930s, almost every major crime family in America had an arsenal of Tommy guns. The weapon became a necessity for any gang that wanted to survive. Gangsters weren't just robbing banks anymore. They were outgunning the police. The problem was simple. Cops still carried old-school 6-shot revolvers and pump-action shotguns. Slow, inaccurate, useless in a gunfight against a fully automatic machine gun. The Mafia, on the other hand, had Tommy guns with 50-round drum magazines. They didn't have to be accurate, they just sprayed bullets and ran. And the public noticed. Newspapers started calling the Tommy gun the gun that made the 20s roar. And it wasn't just the Mafia that was using them. By the early 1930s, the Tommy gun had become the weapon of choice for America's most notorious outlaws. John Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, Babyface Nelson, Machine Gun Kelly. These weren't just bank robbers. They were criminals who had declared war on the U.S. government. John Dillinger, one of the most feared criminals in history, once said, "The police can't catch me, not when I've got a Tommy gun." And he was right. In 1933, during a botched escape from an Indiana jail, Dillinger's gang used Tommy guns to gun down police officers and fight their way out in a hail of bullets. They didn't just escape. They humiliated the authorities in broad daylight. Or take Babyface Nelson, a man who didn't just carry a Tommy gun. He worshipped it. During a legendary FBI shootout in 1934, Nelson went up against federal agents armed with pistols and shotguns. He was outnumbered, outgunned, but he had a Tommy gun in each hand. Instead of running, he charged straight at the FBI, spraying bullets in all directions. By the time the fight was over, Nelson was fatally wounded. But he had killed 2 federal officers and wounded another. The Tommy gun had made criminals unstoppable, and the U.S. government couldn't let it continue. By 1934, the public was demanding action. Machine gun crime had spiraled out of control. Law enforcement was losing the war against gangsters. And that's when President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed into law the National Firearms Act, NFA, the first major federal gun control law in American history. The law didn't ban Tommy guns outright, but it made them nearly impossible for civilians to own. A $200 tax stamp was introduced, essentially doubling the price of the gun overnight. Every owner had to register their firearm with the government. Strict background checks were introduced for all machine gun purchases. Almost overnight, the Tommy gun disappeared from civilian hands. But while the golden age of the gangster Tommy gun was over, the gun itself was far from finished. Because just as the U.S. government was cracking down on its use in America, another war was about to give the Tommy gun a second life. By the late 1930s, the Tommy gun was disappearing from the hands of gangsters. The new gun laws had worked, at least on paper. Machine guns became harder to buy, and the Mafia had to find other ways to enforce its power. But the story of the Thompson wasn't over, because while America was trying to erase the Tommy gun from its streets, the world was preparing for war. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Within months, Europe was on fire. and by 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States was thrown into World War II. The US Army needed a reliable close-range automatic weapon, something that could be used in fast-moving battles, urban combat, and jungle warfare. And guess what? The Tommy gun was perfect for the job. Suddenly, the same weapon that had once built criminal empires was now being used to defend democracy. The military quickly modified the design. They removed the expensive polished wood finish, simplified the sights, and switched to 30-round box magazines instead of the old 50-round drum. This new version, the M1A1 Thompson, was issued to paratroopers, commandos, and frontline troops. And they loved it. The Tommy gun was deadly at close range, easy to fire, and incredibly durable. In D-Day, the Pacific Campaign, and the liberation of Europe, the Tommy gun became a battlefield legend. American soldiers stormed beaches, cleared enemy trenches, and fought house to house in war-torn cities, all while carrying the same gun that had once ruled the streets of Chicago. Even Winston Churchill was photographed holding a Tommy gun, symbolizing its status as a weapon of power. But as effective as it was, the Thompson had one big problem. It was expensive. Each gun cost $225 to manufacture, while newer alternatives, like the M3 grease gun, cost only $20 per unit. By 1944, the military began replacing the Tommy gun with cheaper submachine guns. And by the end of the war, production officially stopped. The Tommy gun's time on the battlefield was over, but that didn't mean the gun disappeared. Because in the post-war years, the Tommy gun took on a new life. Not as a weapon, but as a legend. By the 1950s, the Tommy gun was no longer a weapon of war. The military had moved on to newer, cheaper firearms, and gangsters could no longer get their hands on Thompsons like they once did. But instead of fading into history, the Tommy gun became something bigger than a weapon. It became a legend, and that's thanks to Hollywood. Gangster movies exploded in popularity during the 1950s and 1960s. Films like Little Caesar and The Public Enemy cemented the Tommy gun as the ultimate symbol of organized crime. Then came The Godfather. Francis Ford Coppola's 1972 masterpiece made sure that every time audiences thought of a gangster, they pictured him holding a Tommy gun. That wasn't an accident. Hollywood directors knew that the Tommy gun wasn't just a prop. It was a visual statement. A mob boss sitting in a chair with a revolver. That's one thing. But a mob boss standing in the shadows holding a Thompson? That was a message. Power, fear, control. The Tommy gun became the signature weapon of the American gangster, even decades after real mobsters stopped using it. And it wasn't just in movies. Video games like Mafia, Call of Duty, and Grand Theft Auto kept the Tommy gun alive for new generations. It became a pop culture icon, a symbol of rebellion and crime. Today, owning a Tommy gun is nearly impossible without special government approval. Legal, fully automatic Thompsons cost tens of thousands of dollars, making them collector's items rather than weapons. But make no mistake, the Tommy gun changed history. It built fortunes, it destroyed lives, it reshaped gun laws forever. And even though it's no longer in the hands of gangsters or soldiers, the legend of the Tommy gun will never die. If you want a video on a specific weapon, drop it in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more.